Welcome. It has been a terrific week of panel discussions during National Clean Energy Week. I think we're rounding out the end here, and we're honored to do that. Of course, they save the best for last. Thank you to Crest for putting this together. This is Workable Solutions for Nature, and I want to introduce our panelists. First, my name is Pasha Majdi with Conservation International. Our panelists are Lesley Jantarasami, Managing Director of the Energy Program at the Bipartisan Policy Center, Christine Cadigan, Senior Director of the Family Forest Carbon Program at American Forest Foundation, and Diana Movius, Senior Director of Global Forest Policy at Climate Advisors. Lesley, welcome.
Thanks so much, Pasha. It's great to be here. And again, we are the Bipartisan Policy Center. And one of the reasons we're thrilled to be on this panel today talking about natural climate solutions is the fact that, we're all about where are there areas to bridge, between the parties to talk about solutions to the threats, that face our country and how to make our country stronger, both economically and, across different issue areas. And so for us, in thinking about energy and climate change and the connections to nature-based solutions, it's really all about this area where we see lots of opportunity. We really think that natural climate solutions are going to play a large role in climate discussions moving forward. And so we're very thrilled to be, part of this conversation today.
Thanks, Lesley. Christine, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for the welcome. As you mentioned, I work for the American Forest Foundation, and the American Forest Foundation, or AFF, is a national conservation organization that specifically works with and through family landowners to provide meaningful conservation impact. What I can say is we work across a broad coalition of other conservation organizations, policymakers, our public and private partnerships, and certainly with landowners to provide this conservation impact. And over the past couple of years in particular, we've focused on the opportunity for forests to provide meaningful climate mitigation. And so that's where we launched our Family Forest Carbon Program. And I have been the leader on the Family Forest Carbon Program at AFF since its inception. It's a partnership between AFF and the Nature Conservancy, and both of our organizations came together to try to design and implement a program that specifically worked for small family landowners. So excited to share a little bit more about that with you all.
Terrific, and we're happy to have you. Diana, welcome.
Great, thank you, Pasha. As Pasha mentioned, I'm Senior Director for Global Forest Policy at Climate Advisors, and Climate Advisors is a DC-based think tank and consultancy that specializes in the intersection of international climate policy with domestic climate policy. Some of the issue areas we focus on are, of course, forest and natural climate solutions, as well as energy and diplomacy. In the forest space, I'll be representing more of an international perspective in this panel. We've been focusing for many years on how developed countries such as the US and our other developed country partners can work with developing countries, particularly in the tropics, to stop deforestation so that the whole world can see the benefit, both for climate, for biodiversity, for innovation and more of maintaining those forests and of stopping tropical deforestation. This obviously has a number of components. There's a public finance component, there's a carbon markets component, there's a trade and commodities component. We'll be getting onto all of those later today, and I'm so excited to be here.
Thank you. Before we dive into the issues, let's take a step back for just a second. I'd like to start with a question that I think half the audience is probably thinking right now. What on earth are natural climate solutions? We have a simple explanation of the concept and also an overview of the potential for impact in the United States or internationally. Lesley.
Yeah, I'll just start off by saying, so natural climate solutions, in our view, is really, it's all about increasing the amount of carbon stored in nature. So in plants, trees, soils, and then also reducing greenhouse gas emissions that contribute to climate change from the agriculture and forestry sections. And so when we brought together, our program all focused on natural climate solutions, it really was thinking about this nexus between how farmers, ranchers, forest landowners, and forest managers can all play a role in addressing climate change through the policy supports and programs that are needed to deliver, more across the landscape, more extensive implementation of natural climate solutions. And so we see this through changes in agricultural practices themselves that can help build soil health, that can, enhance the development of, healthy forests and other ecosystems that store carbon. And we can also see that in different practices that can help, reduce methane emissions from livestock management, that can also, reduce things like nitrous oxide emissions from fertilizer. And so there are a range of actual actions that kind of all roll up into this overarching term that we use on natural climate solutions. But in general, we really are focused on those opportunities for storing more carbon and taking advantage of the natural benefits of the resource base here in the United States and abroad, and really thinking through those opportunities to have it be part of the conversation when we're thinking about better supporting agriculture, forestry, and land management and sustainability, how that contributes to climate change mitigation.
Well, agricultural, forestry, and land use are very interesting topics. The Republican Party and conservatives generally have been very interested in this topic domestically. Christine, can you speak to activities in the United States in that area and natural climate solutions?
Yeah, certainly. Thanks. Thanks for the opportunity. I think it's helpful to also ground in some of the latest research and the understanding that research from the Nature Conservancy and some other groups have suggested that natural climate solutions have the potential to provide over a third of our needed climate mitigation globally within the next decade. That's a pretty substantial contribution, and one that we should absolutely look to further leverage. So when you kind of dive deeper on that research, actually, and look within what are the opportunities domestically, the two most dominant pathways, the two most dominant nature-based pathways, are actually lie within our U.S. forests, and that is reforestation, or planting trees, and improved forest management, or actually changing the way that we manage our existing forests. So in order to activate these forests across the U.S., we also have to think about who owns these forests and how can we actually leverage this opportunity. And that's where it's really interesting to note that in the US, 40% of forests are actually owned by small individual landowners. And just to put this kind of back into a global context, these trends are not just unique to the US, right? These small holders are not just important in what they could potentially contribute in the US, but globally, I think 65% of land is owned by smallholders. So these are challenges that we will experience certainly domestically, but also, of course, internationally. I think that the good news domestically is that landowners actually want to do right by their land. They care about their forests. They want to manage their forests in a way that it responsibly stewards this resource. It's just that they actually lack the technical assistance and the financial resources to do so. I think it's about 1 in 5 landowners in the US have received technical assistance and support and long-term forest management planning. And 1 in 3 of these landowners, or one in 3 of these landownership of landowners in this landownership group make less than $50,000 annually. So again, lacking the technical expertise, lacking the financial resources needed to actually manage their forest in a way that will respond to this climate mitigation challenge.
Wow, those are some compelling statistics. I just want to reiterate, up to a third of the net emissions reductions that we would need to make by 2030 for a global approach to climate change. I think some people have misunderstanding that natural climate solutions are a sideshow, if you will, maybe 2%, 4%, 5%, something like that. But we're talking about a third. That's center stage. Diana.
Yeah, thanks, Pasha. And just to piggyback off of that statistic and Christine's comments as well. So when we think about getting to a third of the mitigation that we need in the next decade, I think a helpful phrase that we're all familiar with is an all of the above strategy. So natural climate solutions contain solutions for developed countries like the US in terms of the measures that my colleagues were just talking about. But we also need to engage developing countries. And the two top pathways to get to that 30% of the mitigation that we need by 2030, one is tree planting, afforestation, reforestation, as Christine mentioned. The other is stopping, halting, and reversing tropical deforestation. And tropical deforestation at this point has risen to an absolutely urgent issue that can really make or break natural climate solutions as a whole. So I encourage us in this panel, while we obviously want to understand what we can do here at home in the US for US farmers and ranchers, forest owners and land managers, we also want to be thinking about how can US, through our public finance, through our interests in carbon markets, and through our trade measures in promoting free trade and promoting US-based products, make a dent in that tropical deforestation issue.
It's incredibly compelling. What an opportunity that we have working internationally to address tropical deforestation. Just to underscore what you said and give people a sense of the scope of the problem here. There's been a lot of conversation about China and the United States and energy production over National Clean Energy Week, as there should be. If you were to focus just on forests, looking at forests alone, if deforestation were a country, it would be the third largest emitter after China and the US. So putting that in context is interesting and helps show how important natural climate solutions are. One thing that I find very interesting about natural climate solutions is that, politically speaking, so many supporters actually support natural climate solutions for reasons other than climate, which is kind of funny. There seems to be a broad range of reasons to support natural climate solutions. What are the benefits of natural climate solutions, including those not directly from climate impact? Lesley?
Yeah, Pasha, this is exactly the crux of why the Bipartisan Policy Center convened a task force. We've been meeting for over a year now, and it's comprised of about 20 leaders from across agricultural and forestry industries. We also have included, environmental and conservation groups, folks that really care about biodiversity and wildlife habitat, that want to see opportunities for the government to really step up and support these areas of how the agriculture and forestry industries can play a role in addressing climate change. And so our task force, what we're calling our Farm and Forest Carbon Solutions Task Force, it's actually co-chaired by former Senators Saxby Chambliss and Heidi Heitkamp. So we really see this interest across both parties to have some U.S. domestic leadership on natural climate solutions, and really taking it seriously and really emphasizing the role of this incredibly important sector in how we meet our climate change goals. And just to underscore, here in the U.S., we already see from the land sector itself, about 14% of annual U.S. greenhouse gas emissions are stored in the land base and the natural resources that we already have. So we see a ton of benefit that actually doesn't always get appreciated in these conversations on climate and the importance of a clean energy transition. So we really, again, the task force that the Bipartisan Policy Center convened is really seeing this opportunity not only from the standpoint of how we can use this to meet climate goals, but also to deliver additional benefits to things like biodiversity and wildlife habitat, how investments in soil health can actually help crop productivity and reduce inputs that farmers use, such as water, and it can help with increased drought resilience. Reduced emphasis on fertilizers. So farmers and producers, depending on the types of practices that are implemented, and it also depends on geographies, but we see opportunities to actually reduce costs for production in the agricultural space. We also see opportunities for livestock management and helping to prevent and provide new opportunities to capture emissions like methane through anaerobic digesters, to reuse these, and really there are different ways of creating new economic and monetary benefits from some natural climate solutions. And so the rural community kind of level focus on natural climate solutions can really be an economic story that we see. And so, having new supports, whether that's through, implementation of new projects through a voluntary carbon market framework, or from, the actual implementation of conservation practices and expansion of, new opportunities for the USDA programs to play a role here. We see these as beneficial for economies and for individual operations. So lots of reasons to be excited. Beyond just the climate benefits, I think it's the economic piece, the habitat protection and restoration of healthy ecosystems, and then that has kind of knock-on benefits for resilience to the impacts of climate change itself and to extreme weather, like through droughts. We haven't even touched on wildfires yet, but that's a huge, portion of kind of these other benefits that having healthy forests can really provide in terms of reducing the impacts of these large catastrophic wildfires that are becoming more and more frequent and more severe. And so, we see lots of opportunities to advance the conversation, depending on all of these types of benefits.
Right, a broad range of benefits there, and I think that explains why there's such a broad range of political support. Speaking of politics, climate has been rather newsworthy in U.S. politics over the past couple of months. How does the recently passed Inflation Reduction Act, sometimes referred to as the biggest climate bill in American history, affect opportunities for natural climate solutions? Christine.
Yeah, thank you. The Inflation Reduction Act really includes transformational funding for these climate, these nature-based solutions, this climate smart forestry in particular. Specifically, there is over $8 billion in the EQIP, or the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. It's one of the Farm Bill conservation programs. Resources in that program are there to support soil carbon, or practices that capture or sequester greenhouse gas emissions, among many other climate smart activities. And second, and very important, particularly for programs like the one that I work on, there is over $450 million in competitive grants and cost share to support underserved forest landowners, or small landowners in particular, to implement forestry practices that increase carbon sequestration and storage, specifically by participating in markets, by participating in carbon markets. So why does this matter? I think, as I stated before, cost is a big issue for forest landowners. So these investments really will go a long way in order to get them off the sidelines and helping contribute to a climate mitigation solution. The other reason why this is such an important investment is that landowners tend to lean towards markets for a solution. They offer a voluntary approach for action rather than having to resort to some regulatory approaches or opportunities. And the other another reason too is that carbon markets, because they're an emerging market, particularly for forests, or as it relates to small forest owners, they provide an alternative revenue stream, a revenue stream that these forest owners wouldn't have otherwise realized. So it's really great that some of these provisions in the IRA actually encourage and validate participation in these markets. And then, certainly last but not least, I think it really sends a strong signal from Congress on the importance of carbon markets and the validity, the integrity of participating in these international carbon markets.
Right. And you mentioned markets, private sector role, voluntary participation. As long as I've been around, Republicans have been calling for the private sector to play a major role in climate change solutions. In fact, private sector leadership seems, in my opinion, seems to be core to the Republican or conservative ethos. You also frequently hear calls for voluntary participation, as you mentioned, voluntary participation from the private sector and you hear support for public-private partnerships. What is the opportunity for the government to work with the private sector on natural climate solutions? Right back to you, Christine.
Yeah, thank you. This is a great segue. So I appreciate the question. And just to reiterate, as you've already said, everyone has a role to play, from corporations, private foundations, to producers like forest landowners, and certainly the government themselves. And I think they've started to demonstrate in the IRA and in other recent programs how they want to leverage these public-private partnerships and really rely on experts in their field to unlock these additional revenue streams, and just kind of bring more expertise and finance to bear to realize these goals. So a couple of reasons, I think, what are some of the greatest opportunities I see for the government to leverage to leverage the private private partners in the work that we do and implementing these climate smart forestry practices. They're really costly at the outset. That's, again, one of the biggest barriers for landowners, is to actually have the cash to afford to implement these activities on the ground. And for project developers who are trying to include these small landowners in this work, knowing that these are really cost prohibitive activities, we're seeking some financing to really kickstart or catalyze our ability to realize these forest carbon programs. So we've certainly gone and tried to look for innovative financing solutions in form of green bonds, obviously philanthropy, advanced market commitments from buyers. All of these things certainly come into play. But we're still, understandably, kind of weary of the reality that, I think we've all probably seen in the news that we expect that this private climate finance, this climate investing, may plateau over the coming year, or over the rest of the year and into next year. And it would be really great for the government to send some strong signals, and really validate these forest carbon markets. And they can do so in a couple of different ways. They've done this with some other non-carbon related commodities by providing kind of loan or bond guarantees in particular, which enables project developers or folks working on these programs to get that backing that they need in order to bring the private finance to the table simultaneously. And actually, there is a piece of legislation that was introduced by Senators Stabenow and Braun and Representatives Pingree and Stefanik, the Rural Forest Markets Act, which does just this. It provides a bond or a loan guarantee up to $150 million, which again would that guarantee would leverage billions of dollars of private climate finance and enable us to unlock some of these opportunities within existing forest carbon within existing carbon markets.
Interesting. Yeah, it raises the question to me. The first thing that comes to mind is this model applicable outside the United States as well? Diana?
Yes, thanks, Pasha. I mean, the great news is that there's definitely a role for public-private partnerships in unlocking the mitigation potential of tropical forests and in stopping deforestation. And in fact, these models have been proven over the past decade. Just to bear with me here for a short history lesson, but one of the first public-private partnership models was through the World Bank and the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility, of which the U.S. was a founding member. But this facility also included private sector companies and NGOs. And so what this did was worked with countries, many developing countries with tropical forests, to boost their capacity to stop deforestation. And this involved everything from improved mapping of where the forests are, clarifying who owns the forests, producing and improving satellite data, and being able to monitor that data in real time for deforestation, and ultimately to agree upon a methodology of verifying that the amount of deforestation reduced could result in a verifiable carbon credit. And once those credits were produced through this facility, certain countries simply bought these credits and retired them, saying, this is my contribution to the atmosphere. We don't want to use these credits for our own goals or for compliance. But the private sector participants And even some of the NGO participants reserve the right to use those credits for potential compliance carbon market use in the future. And that's kind of the pilot example. But now what we really want to see is that on a larger scale. So for example, at the United Nations Framework Convention, COP26 last year in Glasgow, the US and a whole slew of private companies, as well as supported by the government of Norway, launched something called the LEAF Coalition. And this included Amazon, Bear, Delta Airlines, Walmart, many household names. And the goal here is really for the sovereign countries to help lay the capacity, prime the pump, so to speak, in developing countries, tropical forest countries, for those countries to meet a high level of carbon market standard for avoiding deforestation. And then once that standard is met, the companies in the agreement, agree to buy a certain number of credits from reduced deforestation in that host country. And so here we basically, in both cases, we see the example of public funds, whether it's through government, in some cases even through philanthropy, coming in to work with the country to lay the foundation to reduce deforestation. And that's sort of helping enable the supply, so to speak. And then the demand to actually buy those carbon credits and pay that country for those reductions comes from the private sector. And this is really important now because more and more Fortune 500, Fortune 100 companies, even small businesses are making their own net zero climate commitments. And in some cases, they will have to source those reductions from outside of the US. And so this is an area where we see a benefit to US companies meeting their corporate sustainability targets. We see a benefit to developing countries because they can get their deforestation under control and improve sustainable development. We see a benefit to the climate because deforestation is reduced. And we see a benefit to the US as a leader and an enabler of natural climate solutions.
Right, and these targets that you're mentioning, these are voluntarily set. Do I understand that correctly?
Mm-hmm. That's correct.
Thanks. Lesley?
Yeah, I just wanted to add on that, in this issue of public-private, in the sense that we have a lot of opportunities here to increase the coordination and enhance sort of communication across jurisdictional boundaries. So I say that because a lot of the land ownership across the United States and certainly in other parts of the world are very much this checkerboard. We have large public lands that are managed either by the Forest Service or other federal agencies. We have lots of the smaller private landowners, as Christine was mentioning, and then we also have Native American tribes who have a lot of the land base and resources in the United States and otherwise. And so when we talk about natural climate solutions, I think it's important to recognize the kind of importance of the landscape and really thinking about this as a regional effort where all land ownerships and all owner types should be involved in implementation of natural climate solutions where possible. And so one great example here is the importance of coordination and cross-jurisdictional efforts around wildfire, because obviously the fire is not going to stop at the border of the national forest, for example. It's not going to be one up to one landowner to really fix the problem. And so having that programs, having policies that can help support more efforts that can coordinate across jurisdictions, I think that would be really beneficial and something that our task force has called for in its policy recommendations.
Well, this conversation is incredibly well timed. The Amazon 21 Act was introduced in the Senate just this morning, less than 2 hours ago, a bill that creates a fund for public-private partnerships to finance natural climate solutions projects in developing countries, just as we were discussing. It was introduced in the Senate on a bipartisan basis. That's the theme we've been talking about, led by Senator Menendez, who's chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and Senator Braun, who's co-chairman of the Senate Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus. This new development on Amazon 21 and the overwhelming Senate support for the Growing Climate Solutions Act seem to indicate that public-private partnerships and carbon markets specifically are a popular space for bipartisan agreement. Switching gears a little bit, we're in DC. It has to be mentioned that it's election season. And of course, elections are not just happening in the United States, they're happening all over the world. Some of those elections will have an enormous impact on natural climate solutions globally. Diana, can you speak to election politics?
Yes, thanks, Pasha. One of the elections that people in the natural climate solution space, from the international perspective, are watching closely is the Brazil presidential election. And in fact, next week there's a round one voting, essentially a choice between the current president Bolsonaro and the candidate running to replace him, Lula. And there are stark differences between the two candidates when it comes to forests. One of the challenges with forest conservation under the Bolsonaro presidency over the last 5 years has been that his administration has not enforced Brazil's forest laws. And so what's happened is that deforestation has gone up every year that Bolsonaro was in office, and it's reached the highest level this past year in over a decade. Some of you may remember in 2019, there was great concern over the number of fires in the Amazon, and even there was a bipartisan group of senators that wrote an official letter of concern, wanting to look at ways the U.S. could get involved and help stop the fires. It's really hard to do that if there is a president that does not enforce forest laws. So a couple of examples are, funding the environmental agencies that go out and check for forest fires and try to enforce boundaries of property. There's also an Amazon fund that would award grants to state governments, civil society, indigenous groups for them to implement their own forest conservation projects. But I think the larger challenge has been that, in essence, and we can talk about this a little bit later, but there's been a culture of impunity that Bolsonaro has created, where there is no consequence to stealing land. It would be as if you could, burn down your neighbor's house next door and not face any consequences for it. And so that is one reason that forest fires and deforestation has risen so sharply. In contrast, obviously, as the competing candidate, Lula has presented himself as the kind of pro-forest candidate. It's obviously too early to tell if he's going to win or what he would do under office. But I will say that I think people that are very focused on the Amazon basin in particular are hopeful for a change of administration.
Interesting, and that will take place in the near future. Gosh, that example that you gave, first thing that came to mind was, burning down your neighbor's property would not go over very well in the United States. I think that would cause some problems. Speaking of the U.S., Lesley, elections domestically, what can we expect for outcomes for natural climate solutions?
Well, I mean, their elections are obviously right around the corner, and I'm not going to sort of weigh in on what I think is going to happen, but I will say that if leadership were to change, party hands, either within the House of Representatives or in the Senate, the effect really for folks that work on federal policies for natural climate solutions is just, who's in charge essentially of the relevant committees. So if we're talking about agriculture committees, we're talking about natural resources committees, these are the folks that help drive the policy agendas and the introduction of new legislation that can be supportive of natural climate solutions. And I think a good example here, one that we're really focused on for BPC and for our task force, is our opportunities upcoming in the renegotiation of the Farm Bill. So in 2023, essentially the next Farm Bill cycle really kicks off in earnest. And so, this has historically been an incredibly bipartisan process, where we have opportunities to introduce, legislation that supports the twin goals of, conservation and, agriculture and climate change. And so I think that, the effect of the election really is on how that moves forward and how those conversations occur and through what committees. And so that's kind of how we're thinking about that.
Right, and no matter what the outcomes are in November, the Farm Bill will proceed. It always has, it always will. Another example of bipartisanship. And the topics we're discussing today will find a way into that for our domestic natural climate solutions because they have bipartisan. Speaking of bipartisan events, CRESS hosted a gala last night in DC. It was a spectacular event. It was great to see so many from the center right who want America to lead the world on energy, environment, and conservation policy. Former Senator Kelly Ayotte hosted a panel discussion and asked an interesting question about trade and domestic industry. She asked about the Trump or MAGA call for more domestic production and the push to try to tie trade deals to increase domestic production in the energy sector. Is this question relevant to natural climate solutions as well? Diana.
That's a great question, Pasha. And the short answer is yes, it is relevant to natural climate solutions. Really, I think it's an essential part of making sure that we can take full advantage of natural climate solutions both here and abroad. So I think the main way that this can affect U.S. production is by supporting U.S. farmers and ranchers and even foresters through trade policy that does prioritize U.S. producers. And bear with me here for a second, but this gets into also issues of deforestation and illegality. So, for example, at this point in time, we know from studies that 95% of deforestation that's occurring in the Brazilian Amazon is illegal. And most of this is tied to agricultural commodities, in particular cattle. And the US is a major importer of cattle, which means that we are actually importing not just the cattle, but also the deforestation. And to the earlier analogy that I made, burning down your neighbor's house without consequence, this is essentially land grabbing, burning down forests, raising cattle, and exporting it to the U.S. In contrast, U.S. farmers have to pay for their land. They have to undergo very rigorous health and safety checks. And we have some of the highest efficiency in cattle production in the world, much more so than Brazil-based beef. And so one of the issues that lawmakers have been grappling with is how to deal with this. So under President Trump, he actually put in a 3-year ban on Brazilian beef. Obviously, once that ban was lifted several years ago, Brazil beef has continued to really flood the U.S. market. So one piece of legislation that I'm really excited about, and others that focus a lot on tropical forests, as well as U.S. farmer and rancher issues, is the Forest Act. And this was a piece of legislation introduced last year by Senator Schatz with co-sponsorship in the House by Representative Fitzpatrick, a Republican, as well as Blumenauer, who's a Democrat. We don't yet have a Republican co-sponsor for the Forest Act, but I think hopefully that's a matter of time because this is an issue that is obviously bipartisan in my perspective. But the Forest Act would essentially require importers to do their own due diligence on key agricultural commodities, including beef, soy, palm oil, pulp and paper, cocoa, and rubber. And the idea would be to make sure that the U.S. is not importing anything that is the product of illegal deforestation. And obviously these different commodities have different import volumes and different financial effects for the U.S. economy. But a big one, as I mentioned, is cattle. And I think there's where we can maybe see one of the earliest and biggest wins if we prioritize U.S. producers.
They're cutting down trees and undercutting U.S. producers. That's a bad combination. Somebody ought to do something about that. Lesley, what's
Exactly.
happening at home with federal agencies?
Yeah, and I just wanted to also kind of piggyback off that because our task force talked a lot about the fact that, we have U.S. producers here that adhere to a high level of sustainability in their operations, and how does that differentiate U.S.-based agricultural and forest products from other parts of the world? And so, we're really wanting to capture that, additional benefit that U.S. producers and U.S. produced products really bring to the table here. And so, we see domestically here a new program that the USDA has been rolling out over the past year or so called the Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities. They just recently announced awards for the first round that will go towards organizations, companies, and partnerships that are all about this issue of how do we develop better products in the U.S. that are, commodities that could be exported, or consumed here domestically, and how do we do that in a more climate friendly way? And so it's really, something that is top of mind also for some of the federal agencies and federal policies.
Okay, switching gears a little bit, but before we do, I just have to hone in on that statistic again. Diana, did you say it was 95% is illegal, meaning against the law, deforestation in Brazil?
That's what the recent research shows, yes.
That's just a shocking statistic. Let's
Yeah.
talk about inclusivity. How do we bring historically underrepresented communities into the policy conversation? And how do we work with Indigenous peoples to implement natural climate solutions? Diana.
Great, I'm so glad you asked. So this is an area where there's been a lot of recent developments. Obviously, talked a lot about Brazil and the Amazon basin during this session. There are many indigenous groups that live in the Amazon basin. There are many indigenous groups that live in other tropical forest basins, including the Congo basin in Central Africa and the forests of Southeast Asia. But it's important to recognize this because indigenous peoples in tropical forests have been shown through science and through remote sensing, satellite-based monitoring to be the most effective stewards of forests. So if you're looking for kind of a bang for the buck, where can we best invest public funds or even private funds? Empowering and funding indigenous communities to defend their territories, to steward their land is really the most efficient approach. And so there have been some challenges to doing this. At the moment, there is a land tenure facility that was started last year in COP and trying to make progress on how do you find the model to fund Indigenous communities directly. The Ford Foundation, the Christensen Fund, and several other philanthropies are looking at this. And the idea would be that if Indigenous communities can create their own vehicle to receive funds, so this would be kind of a local fund, at a local bank managed by Indigenous people, that could be the recipient of public or philanthropic dollars. It's a little bit harder for the U.S. at the moment to follow this model, but one of the things that this pilot philanthropy project is doing is trying to figure out how can countries as well channel money directly to the ground without going through expensive intermediaries. So I'm really optimistic that we'll learn some good lessons and be able to channel more funds directly to Indigenous peoples who can by far safeguard their forests better than anyone else.
Right, and Indigenous people are stewards of nearly 40% of the world's intact landscapes. So partnerships and collaboration with Indigenous people and local communities are critical for the success of natural climate solutions. Christine, would you like to comment further?
Yeah, just kind of bringing it back again to a US context. I think working with forests and working with forest landowners also provides us with a unique opportunity to advance some of our diversity, equity, and inclusion goals that we may have. And forest landowners in particular come from obviously a wide range of backgrounds. We know that roughly 6% of these landowners come from minority backgrounds. And these landowners in particular, they face some unique challenges. Many of these landowners don't have clear title, and these heirs property issues can be really convoluted and complex as you think about generational transfer and making sure that future generations are set up for success and set up to actually take advantage of farm bill conservation programs or certainly forest carbon projects. So lots of opportunity to leverage some of these programs to advance the goals of these communities. But then when we also look more broadly at the challenge around natural climate solutions and forests in the US, the challenges that these minority landowners, as well as just small landowners in general, face, they share a lot of those same challenges. We know that less than 1% of the forest carbon projects today are actually comprised of projects that are owned by small individual family landowners. Why? I think we've said this a couple times, but it's really costly. There are some cost prohibitive barriers associated with signing up for forest carbon projects that these small landowners they just can't capitalize on economies of scale like some of the larger landowners are able to. The forest carbon markets are really complex. They're really confusing for small landowners to digest and understand their opportunities. And many of these opportunities require 100-year contracts or longer, even. And that's really difficult for small family landowners to kind of think about that long-term, even generational family planning, right? It's just a really challenging concept. So I think it's really important for us to think about how we can design and implement programs that work for these small landowners that certainly still uphold the credible claims, the credible climate or carbon claims that we're making, but also incorporate some innovative and unique designs that help overcome some of the challenges that minority landowners in the U.S. face, or even small landowners more generally. Um, of course, because it would really benefit these landowners. It would really advance their ability to be good forest stewards. And it would also enable us to unlock a really substantial climate mitigation opportunity that has otherwise been sidelined.
Right. It's amazing that such a small percentage of the financing is going to the small landowners, and yet you were saying earlier how the small landowners actually comprise a huge amount percentage-wise. I don't know if you can repeat the statistic, but a huge amount percentage-wise of landowners in the United States.
That's right. 40% of U.S. forests are owned by small landowners.
I think one of the reasons for that, and you got to this a little bit, it's so cumbersome to qualify for the funding. That's not inherently a bad thing. For years, there's been criticism over these markets as they've been developing and emerging as processes for the public funds to foster uh, private donations and private spending for climate mitigation and natural climate solutions. But as it's been developing, there's been a lot of work put into making sure that the standards are set high, verification, etc. And as a result of that, and I'm not saying that this is a bad thing, it's a double-edged sword, really. As a result of that, we have verification processes that require hundreds of thousands of dollars in consulting fees if you don't want to do it in-house, and it's essentially nearly impossible to do in-house if you're a small landowner. Hope I can say that speaking a little liberally right now, but so if it's costing hundreds of thousands of dollars, who's going to help the small landowners participate in carbon markets, even voluntarily, just so they can receive funds to keep the family farm, so to speak? There are a lot of options out there. One of them is technical assistance from the federal government. That's an element of the Growing Climate Solutions Act that had over 90 votes in the Senate, not just bipartisan, but extremely popular. That's an element of the Amazon 21 Act, which is, of course, a very similar model, but it's internationally applied. And there you have even more dramatic extremes in terms of wealth and groups like indigenous peoples that don't have access to these markets without paying hundreds of thousands of dollars in consulting fees. Not saying it's a bad thing, it's just a burden to overcome. And a popular phrase in the Republican Party in many different contexts is barriers to entry to markets. How do we lower the barriers to entry? I've heard that so many times, and it seems highly applicable here. Lesley, I'm going to turn to you next. What's going on at the Bipartisan Policy Center? Do you have a publication that's come out recently on natural climate solutions that the audience should know about, or an enterprise, or something you'd like to share?
Absolutely. Yes, we have a policy recommendations report that was released earlier this year. And, if we can get you the link, we'd love to do that, but definitely just Google us and find our report from the Farm and Forest Carbon Solutions Task Force. It actually features 24 different recommendations, really touching on most of the themes that we've covered in today's panel. Maybe I'll just highlight a few themes that I didn't hear. One of which does, I think, relate to the question you just asked, or comment you just made, Pasha, about barriers to entry and how do we lower, the access, or how do we increase access to, these natural climate solutions programs, whether they're privately financed through the carbon market or to publicly funded government programs. And a lot of that is through the technical assistance. And how do we meet people where they are? How do we ensure that they get the information that they need in order to participate in these programs? The other piece of that is, how do we help support the actual workforce doing the work of natural climate solutions? So the skills needed and the understanding and the data collection kind of to support the implementation of certain practice changes, to know that you're really doing it right, you're doing it to the point where, you can have that verifiable climate benefit, that takes a little bit of specialization. And so how do we provide either, training in terms of, new certifications for workers that are going to be doing natural climate solutions work, or how do we provide that technical assistance through existing programs like university extension programs and other, regionally based support networks for producers. There are a lot of technical service providers out there that receive funding from the USDA to work directly at the field level with individual farmers, ranchers, and forest landowners. And so those are the types of things that we're looking at as opportunities to help bolster, some of the opportunities here. The other that I'll mention, other theme here is research and development. We continually need, new technologies, especially on the monitoring and measurement side of things, that can, on a low-cost basis, be distributed throughout the areas that we want to be able to measure how much carbon is being sequestered and stored in the land. And so be able to do that at a low-cost way can really ease some of these upfront costs that we talked about in terms of what we need in order to verify the climate change benefits. And so having better funded government programs to encourage R&D and innovation to produce new opportunities, not only on monitoring and verifying carbon, but also to develop on the product side. There are different opportunities to have innovative wood products that store carbon, on a long time scale in the actual product itself. And so we looked at some of the opportunities for bolstering markets for mass timber, for example, and other types of advanced wood products that can be sustainably harvested and sustainably developed into products that can then be sold across the world. And so we're seeing these different opportunities both on the economic development, the research side, and the workforce development and training side.
Diana, what's the latest from climate advisors on natural climate solutions?
Thanks, Pasha. Great question. We've been doing a lot of work as well on looking at climate-related financial risk and how natural climate solutions and the risk of deforestation can be incorporated into investment profiles. In terms of direct natural climate solutions like the type we've been talking about here, we've been looking at ways where one or more developed countries can perhaps partner with a developing country to build the capacity of that developing country to stop deforestation, with the views toward kind of longer term partnerships of the kind that we were describing earlier. So how can the developed world build the capacity of tropical forest countries to stop deforestation and then kind of prime the pump, so to speak, for international carbon markets? Those are a couple of things that we've been working on in this area.
Interesting. And Christine, what's the latest from AFF?
Yeah, thank you. I kind of also want to go back to your really insightful statement right before Lesley spoke to, and say that that's actually the challenge that AFF in partnership with the Nature Conservancy has tried to figure out, right? Is how we can bring these landowners to the table. How can we reduce these barriers to entry and do so in a way that promotes a very credible, very transparent carbon claim that can be transacted on the carbon marketplace. So that's really what we've been focused on. We've been dedicating a lot of our resources to this program design and implementation. And it started with developing, again, in partnership with TNC, a new innovative forest carbon accounting methodology, which really just, I'm sure many of you are aware of some of the recent critiques of forest carbon methodologies. We tried to build on some of those very valid critiques and try to incorporate some new innovations in this methodology, such that we feel really confident about the carbon claim that we're making through this program. And at the same time, we're operating this program again as two mission-driven organizations, two nonprofits, trying to de-risk this opportunity as much as possible for landowners, giving them fixed payments that are, again, very transparent. The payments are allocated very much akin to how NRCS operates their conservation programs. These are kind of incentive payments based on the cost of implementing any individual practice. And then the organization, AFF and TNC, assume the responsibility to monetize that claim on the voluntary carbon market. And therefore, we also assume the risk or the potential market volatility in prices. So those are some of the ways that we're trying to break down the barriers to entry, and also trying to finance through our work specific, dedicated, kind of deliberate efforts to reach and engage more inclusive landowner groups, trying to target more minority communities, making sure that we have not only forest management activities that will motivate those particular land ownership groups to participate, but also that we are starting to build some of the tools to both reach and engage those audiences that have previously been underrepresented. So what are the marketing tactics that might be different? What are some of the and I talked a little bit about some of these heirs property issues, but maybe there are some additional legal challenges that we need to invest in order to get those landowners to be able to participate. So we're trying to do all of this in context of what a sustainable conservation business looks like, trying to leverage the private climate finance from voluntary carbon markets, trying to seek some innovative financing to really kind of kickstart and provide some cash for us to actually pay these landowners in order to do this work right at the outset. And again, trying to do so in a way that creates a more inclusive, more equitable access to carbon markets, which have thus far really done, at least for forest carbon projects, have done a really poor job of being able to reach these new and very meaningful, in terms of climate mitigation opportunity, these very meaningful audiences.
Right, and that same issue is so relevant internationally. I'm thinking of developing countries. More than half of the world's GDP already depends in some way on services provided by nature. A collapse of these services would cost more than 2% of GDP globally, not US GDP, but global GDP, approximately $2.7 trillion. That would be each year by 2030. And the poorest countries in the world would be hit the hardest. A future of resource scarcity is what we're trying to avoid. Future of resource scarcity, famines, and climate refugees could await, creating a recipe for conflict and national security risks. 2019 analysis found that such effects have influenced as much as 20% of violent armed conflict over the past century, and that if we stay on our present course, the risk of such violence will increase fivefold. That is a topic we really didn't get into during this panel, but it's highly relevant in the developing world. I wish we had more time to talk about it. We did have time to talk about public-private partnerships. I just wanted to touch on some quick stats before we close. Billions of dollars are available in private capital for nature-based investments, but they're sidelined by uncertainty and risk. That's a topic that you just covered, Christine. We know that the demand is there. We know this. Over the last few years, the voluntary carbon market has surged. Experts estimate that the market for carbon credits could exceed $50 billion before 2030. So this is imminent. And companies, shareholders, and consumers are incredibly motivated to take part in this growing market, which enables them to reduce their carbon footprint by investing in the protection of nature. Private-public partnerships that we've been discussing all morning, all afternoon, they would ensure that these investments reach places they would not ordinarily go. So with that, I want to thank our panelists. Thank you for joining our call today, our panel discussion. And of course, they saved the best for last. And Diana, I hope you don't feel too left out with 3 Blue Devils on the panel here. I didn't bring it up until the very end, but you're an honorary Blue Devil for the day. And with that, we'll close out our last panel for National Clean Energy Week. Thanks for tuning in.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Hey there, thank you all for tuning in and participating in National Clean Energy Week Policymakers Symposium. This week has had an amazing turnout, and I'd like to personally thank all of you for making it the best National Clean Energy Week yet. You took advantage of a fantastic opportunity to collaborate, discuss with, and learn from the clean energy experts. From innovative emissions-reducing technologies to the policy needed to support efficient climate action, we covered a lot of ground this week, and we've learned a lot. I'm proud of the discussions we held between policymakers, business leaders, and clean energy advocates alike, from different political perspectives and from across the country. And although we so often hear that America is more divided than ever, we prove that lasting, meaningful clean energy and climate action can happen when we bring all voices to the table and build strong policy foundations together, like the Energy Act of 2020, the Growing Climate Solutions Act, the Infrastructure and Investment and Jobs Act, and the Kigali Amendment. Though the symposium is over, there is plenty of work to do. We need to use the momentum from this week to spark more conversations and innovative clean energy solutions that can really tackle the challenges Americans are facing every day. Thank you for your participation this week, and I look forward to seeing you all again next year at the 7th National Clean Energy Week. See you September 25th to 29th, 2023.